a very important decision, were very well crafted, and I think it will go a long way toward bringing our country together.
We need someone who knows the difference between right and wrong, between good and bad.
We're going to discuss a number of things in terms of the priorities that certainly we have, which includes getting a hostage deal done, getting aid in, and then getting that 6-week ceasefire.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Thanks for joining us and welcome to America Decides. We are just one day away from Super Tuesday, where more than a third of all available delegates are up for grabs. Former President Donald Trump is expected to further his lead over former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley after tomorrow night. According to a new CBS News poll, Trump also leads President Biden, in a hypothetical head-to-head rematch. We're going to dig into those numbers later, but first, news of the day. It wasn't always a guarantee that Trump would remain on certain primary ballots. Today, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed a Colorado Supreme Court decision that had barred the former president from the state's primary ballot due to his actions on January 6th. And that's where we begin tonight. CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford joins us now to discuss all of this. Jan, thank you for being here. So it was really interesting to actually hear this case as it played out. It was all over cable news and all over the nets. So people really got to listen to these arguments. But can you walk us through how the court arrived at this decision?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the Colorado Supreme Court was the first court in the country to look at this obscure provision of the 14th Amendment and say it was going to find that Donald Trump was an insurrectionist because of his actions around January 6th. And then as a result of that constitutional clause, he could be disqualified from the Colorado ballot. And then after they did that, it was kind of like dominoes, right? You saw like Maine and Illinois and all these other states going like, wait a minute, we want to do that too. So Trump went to the Supreme Court and said, please take up this case. Like you said, they had arguments last month and everyone was listening there. And I think it was clear from those arguments that the justices were like, wait a minute, we cannot have a scenario where a handful of states could dictate the outcome of a presidential election. That's just not a state role for a state court. And so that was the decision we got today, kind of what we expected from those arguments last month. The court was unanimous that the Colorado Supreme Court got it wrong. They just had slightly different reasons and some heated language for how they got to that outcome.
I wanted to ask about that because the liberal justices of the court wrote a separate opinion. What did they say in that opinion?
Yeah, I mean, like, keep in mind, like, they all agree Colorado Supreme Court is wrong and Trump should win this case. But the three liberals wrote separately and said basically that the conservatives, and 5 of the conservatives were in this majority decision, that they'd gone too far. And they decided issues they didn't need to decide, and that the court was all in agreement that it would be chaos if states could do this, that, and the other. And so they all agree there. But then they said that the majority went on and decided things like what should Congress's role be and these other things. And that prompted Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who is a conservative, didn't join the conservatives' opinion, to write a decision of her own saying essentially like, guys, we all agree on this. Why are we amplifying our disagreements in this time? As a court, we should be trying to tone down the national temperature. So it was really a fascinating window, I think, into like some of these disagreements behind the scenes playing out in the writing. And I got to tell you, I mean, this is a court that today there was agreement, there was unanimity on the outcome, and you still saw them fracturing and on the result, on the reasoning. And I don't think that really bodes well for some of these upcoming cases that are hugely controversial, where they're definitely going to have different views on the outcome.
And cases that are going to play such an outsized role in a election year. I mean, taking up abortion medication, mifepristone later.
And then the big
Trump's
one in April,
case.
whether or not Jack Smith, the special counsel, can even try President Trump for some of those actions and potentially, allegedly trying to overthrow, the election. So, that's all on the horizon. This is going to be a really difficult, controversial term for these justices to work through. So, today, I mean, yes, we've got unanimity on the outcome, and the Colorado Supreme Court's wrong, and this ends those state efforts. The Super Tuesday goes forward. Trump's on the ballot.
Right.
It's going to end all those efforts, but they're still arguing back and forth among themselves.
On the reasoning. Yeah, it's kind of like the top line of a poll, but you dig down at the numbers and you really see some disagreements there.
Or like you're saying, like, guys, just straighten up and like, let's move on from this one. They couldn't do it, though. They couldn't come to like that unanimous decision.
Well, interesting point too, especially as these cases are coming up. We'll see what they decide and how they decide it. Jan Crawford, as always, thank you very much for your time. And Colorado's Secretary of State Jenna Griswold is here with us now to discuss this case. Secretary Griswold, thanks so much for being here. I wanted to get your immediate reaction to this ruling.
Thanks for having me on. First and foremost, I'm grateful that there is a decision. It's important that Coloradan and American voters all across the country know whether or not Trump is qualified as we go into Super Tuesday. But I'll also say I'm disappointed. It should be up to Colorado or any state to determine whether oath-breaking insurrectionists go onto our ballots. And ultimately, this case will allow federal candidates who are oath-breaking insurrectionists to get onto ballots without much question. That's because the Supreme Court has left it up to Congress to determine whether to pass a law or take action on oath breakers that are federal candidates. And with this Congress, that is very unlikely.
Well, I want to ask a little more about that in a minute, but to your point about this decision and the immediate impact, is there anything else that your state can do to challenge Trump being on the ballot?
At this point, no. Ultimately, this is a novel case. We have never had a president try to hold on to power and steal the presidency. It was filed by 6 voters who are Republicans and unaffiliated in our state courts and worked its way up. My job as Secretary of State is to uphold the law and the Constitution. And that means in this instance that Trump is a qualified candidate on our ballot and votes cast for him will be counted.
So voters can have the confidence that Trump will appear on that ballot. The court's decision, interestingly, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but the enforcement of that insurrection clause in the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court says that that's up to Congress, not the states. I'm curious what you make of that.
Well, I disagree with that part of the opinion. I think it should be up to states to determine whether oath-breaking insurrectionists go onto our ballots. But the Supreme Court has issued its decision. I think that the bigger picture is that January 6th was just part of Donald Trump's attempt to steal the presidency. He broke the law. He incited that violent mob onto the Congress with the attempt to stop the peaceful transfer of power. And his attacks on democracy have not stopped. They have led to election security threats, threats against election workers, voter suppression laws across this country considered, and already MAGA extremists are trying to sow doubt in the 2024 election.
I'm curious, though, because this was a 9-0 ruling, do you have any regrets or things you wish that the state would have done differently in pressing this case, given that we saw the former president today really celebrate this ruling? And, of course, the Supreme Court is taking up presidential immunity soon as well. Do you feel like this ruling today may have given him kind of a national boost?
I'm disappointed in the ruling. I obviously did believe that the Colorado Supreme Court got it right. But the ruling is the ruling, and I think it's important that we all respect justices' decisions. At the end of the day, Donald Trump is facing 91 felony counts in 4 separate cases. He continues to attack democratic institutions, and it will be up to American voters to really safeguard democracy in November.
All right, Jenna Griswold, we thank you very much for your time. And coming up, new CBS News polling shows Donald Trump with an advantage over President Biden. We'll go over the numbers next. You're streaming America Decides. And welcome back to America Decides. New CBS polling is giving Donald Trump the edge over current President Biden. The former president holds a 4-point advantage nationally. A major reason why appears to be the economy. Voters rated the economy under the Trump administration more fondly than they do under Biden. 65% said the economy was good under Trump, while 38% say the same about Biden's economy. Joining us now is Bob Costa. Bob is CBS News Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. So just digging into these numbers, this was interesting because you and I have been on the campaign trail talking to voters, and I've sensed this talking to Republican voters that they just feel uneasy about how things are right now, and particularly as it pertains to the economy, which is interesting because the economy, at least on paper, it looks good. But voters are not feeling it, and especially Republican voters who are having a better recollection of the economy under Trump.
It's such an important point, Caitlin. You and I have spent so much time trying to listen to voters, really hear what people have to say, and they are putting kitchen table issues front and center in this campaign. So often the conversation in Washington and on Capitol Hill does not correspond to what we're hearing from voters. They really do care about the pain they feel at the pump in terms of their wallet, at the grocery store. And for the Biden administration, the challenge is talking about the economic gains they feel are there and vital and real and tangible to people, but knowing that people also still feel inflationary pain at the same time. And you do see President Biden going out to places like Michigan and the Midwest to try to engage with working Americans, especially those who are part of a labor union, to say he's come through for them with some of his signature bills. But former President Trump's also out there saying if you're a working person in this country, you may feel like you're really struggling. And he's going to be a hammer to the Washington establishment and to the Biden administration. And so both sides are trying to frame this on an economic level as they're the voice, the advocate for the working person. And that's the stiff competition.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know you've done a lot of reporting on the union aspect of this as well. That's really interesting. And Ed, I want to bring you in. Ed O'Keefe, of course, joins us now. He's CBS News senior White House and political correspondent. Ed, we were just talking about these poll numbers and the way in which voters give Trump a higher grade on the economy when he was president than Biden. But I'm wondering how the Biden team is assessing these kind of top line numbers showing Trump with an edge over the current president.
Well, a few things, Caitlin, and it's kind of predictable when you're the guy that's trailing. They're questioning the utility of polls and whether or not they're truly capturing what the country is thinking. They see them as snapshots in time, not necessarily reflective of where things will be in November. They also point out there have been some other national surveys like ours that show the president with a narrow lead, and that for every 2 or 3 that show Trump ahead of the president, the Biden team would argue there's at least 1 or 2 showing the president ahead of Trump. So who are you to believe? And on the issue of the economy, I would point you to what he said to the New Yorker, the president himself, in an interview published today, where he said a lot of the things that I have accomplished are just beginning to kick in. The idea that the billions and tens of billions of dollars in infrastructure spending for rebuilding or building semiconductor manufacturing across the country, the changes in healthcare pricing that we're expected to hear more about later this week in his State of the Union, are beginning to now get to the point where it's on the minds of voters, and you see it again in our survey for the 3rd or 4th straight month. Impressions of the economy are improving, not to a point where a majority of Americans think it's in good shape, but they've seen positive, sustained growth month over month now since about November, which they would say bodes well for them as you get closer to this November, when that will be on the minds of voters. Historically, you might say, well, you've got to have that in place by the spring, and you may not get there by then. But for now, at least, they're hopefully confident. And the other thing they keep saying, and I know this is tough for people who do this every day like we do, and for viewers who watch every day, the election's not today, they say. It's in November. We've got time. And that's a fair point that we should keep in mind.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Ed. And Bob, I mean, Super Tuesday is kind of traditionally the time that's, you know, the biggest day in the campaign so far. This time around, it feels like a little bit of a turning point in terms of the general election stage being set.
It really is a turning point. Nikki Haley has struggled to accumulate delegates, though she did well in the Washington, D.C. primary. So you see Trump taking control of the delegate lead likely on Super Tuesday, but also taking control of the Republican National Committee. And the party is once again becoming a party in his image, under his control. His lieutenants will be installed in the coming weeks, I'm told by my top sources, to run all aspects of the party in different state parties and, of course, at the national level as well. And for President Biden, the challenge is going to be talking about issues like democracy. Can he bring the issue of January 6th back to the fore of our national conversation? Remind people about what happened that day and about Trump's role in and around January 6th in terms of the pressure campaign on former Vice President Pence, the effort to have electors come to Washington. Because the more we move closer to the general election, the further we move away from January 6th. And so many of my sources close to the president say that he wants to raise the stakes here, frame the stakes as something that's really about the democracy's future in this country. But he has to do that in a way that, to voters who are maybe not paying attention to the details of January 6th day in, day out.
Exactly. It's kind of reminding people of what they may have forgotten. It seems like the challenge. Ed, another challenge for the Biden administration, of course, among at least members of his base constituency, perhaps, is the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. I know Vice President Kamala Harris addressed this earlier today. What did she say?
That's right. She had a meeting earlier this Monday with Benny Gantz, who's a member of the Israeli War Cabinet, who made requests of American officials to meet with him while he was here against the wishes of Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government. Gantz was here at the White House earlier for meetings with the Vice President, the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and Brett McGurk, who's a lead envoy to the Middle East. The Vice President explained what the meeting was about before the meeting with the reporters. Take a look.
Well, we're going to discuss a number of things in terms of the priorities that certainly we have, which includes getting a hostage deal done, getting aid in, and then getting that 6-week ceasefire. You know, the president and I have been very clear that Israel has a right to defend itself, that we have got to make sure that innocent civilians aren't being killed, and that we've got to get these hostages out. And that is one of the highest priorities right now we have. And I'll tell you, the president has been an extraordinary leader in getting us to this point that we have the 6-week deal. And so Hamas needs to do its thing, as I talked about yesterday in Selma.
The vice president in Selma, Alabama yesterday had called again for a ceasefire lasting at least 6 weeks to allow hostages to be swapped. We should point out, Gantz is seen as a potential future Israeli prime minister. There's some intrigue about him coming here and the Biden administration meeting with him. He didn't get a meeting with the president because he's up at Camp David, still getting ready for the State of the Union address. And leaving a meeting with the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell just a few minutes ago, he told our Capitol Hill producer Alan He, no, the Americans should still be talking to Netanyahu because, quote, there's a prime minister. So he's here for these meetings to take the temperature, but by no means signaling that he's about to challenge Netanyahu and try to take leadership of Israel.
Interesting note on the politics there. Bob Acosta, thank you very much, and Ed O'Keefe, thank you very much. And speaking of this week, stick with CBS News for Super Tuesday coverage all day tomorrow, including a 1-hour edition of America Decides starting at 5 p.m. Eastern. We'll also have special coverage of the races and the results at 7 p.m. Eastern on Prime Time with John Dickerson, and during a special Campaign 2024 edition of America Decides beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern. And President Biden will deliver the annual State of the Union address on Thursday. That's just one day before the government is set to partially shut down unless Congress takes action. We'll check in on Capitol Hill next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Top lawmakers have unveiled a package to fund key parts of the government. Congress has until Friday to pass it to avert a partial government shutdown. The deadline, is a day after President Biden is set to deliver his State of the Union address. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland joins us now on set. Good to see you. So the government funding deadline is the day after the State of the Union address. Good timing. They have this bill. Will it pass likely, and what's in it?
There's optimism, there's prospects of good things, but let's take a moment, step back, and reflect on the timing. It's 4 to 6 weeks after Groundhog Day, and Groundhog Day is about to end. This thing's likely to pass and push all these deadlines till September, give some more sturdy footing for federal agencies, federal workers, contractors, and all those who are touched by government shutdowns. We know the prospects are good because each party's leadership, Democrats in the Senate, Republicans in the House, are spiking the football on what they're getting and the other side's not. What they're saying is advantageous for them and disadvantageous for the opposition. That's a sign both sides think they're getting a sufficient amount. What's not in here? A lot of those controversial policy riders, each side wants cuts to things or changes to things that simply would never go. They're poison pills. So there's a real finite number of policy changes included. It's really money. It's funding cuts to some things. Generally speaking, though, it's a continuity, a continuation of funding at similar or current levels for so much of what funds the government.
And that stability, at least for the rest of the fiscal year, is welcome, likely, around the country. State of the Union is on Thursday. The president is obviously preparing for it, but I think everybody kind of looks in the audience and sees or wants to know who is there. And a lot of times lawmakers bring guests to send a message. Anything notable this year?
There are going to be a number of them. They try to affect a messaging campaign by bringing certain guests to the State of the Union. It's a tradition that's going on for generations. But I think what you're going to see from Democrats is a synchronized message to try to lean into the issues involving IVF. You're going to have people with tethers to fertility treatments, having received them, having to help provide them, or having benefited from them as some way to reinforce what the president says, or to get the message out to the local communities, the local media before or after the speech about that issue. I think you're going to have Republicans bringing guests that are touched by the issue of border security, those who have stories to tell about issues involving migrants or issues involving major cities coping with the movement of migrants. That you're going to have that in the crowd as well. It's unclear if any of that amplifies what the president says, but it gives each member of Congress a chance to bring that to their hometown communities, their hometown media, and try to sell a message. And having those guests really does get the attention needed.
Yeah, that's really interesting, too, because those are kind of the top issues on both sides driving this election, or at least what the campaigns want to be driving the election: reproductive rights for the Democrats and immigration for the Republicans. Speaking of reproductive rights, Katie Britt is slated to give the response for the Republicans. I say speaking of because she is, of course, a senator from Alabama. That's where that ruling was. She's seen as a rising star in the Republican Party. Significant that she is giving this address?
I think quite significant. She's from Alabama. I think it's indicative of what Republicans expect the president to say Thursday or the Democrats to say in the weeks and months after. This is an issue that everybody's trying to measure. And I think Thursday will give you a good measurement with Katie Britt speaking as a young woman, as the junior senator from the state where this whole thing generated a few weeks ago. And I think it's at this point, everybody's expectation, the president has set aside a bit of bandwidth, perhaps quite a bit of bandwidth, to talk about IVF and reproductive rights is something symmetrical to last year when he spoke about reproductive rights after the Dobbs decision. And this year, it seems like everybody's getting ready for some amount of talking about IVF.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Republicans are likely to have some change in their ranks after November, with Mitch McConnell stepping down. John Thune has announced that he is looking to get into this race to replace McConnell. Not entirely surprising, but what is he advocating for?
Well, he's bringing something with him that is necessary. Still the larger number, if not the plurality or majority of Republicans in the Senate are Mitch McConnell Republicans. John Thune could bring them all in to the fold early on.
Interesting that he endorsed Donald Trump
just before
McConnell said he would step down from leadership. Scott McFarland, a lot to follow on Capitol Hill this week. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
And that does it for us today. We will be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. You're streaming CBS News.